All right, it is about time for us to go ahead and start our second session. Had a good little break. It was wonderful fellowshipping with everybody and getting to know people. For those who are just coming in, we have Dean Miller with us. He has been a gospel preacher for a number of years, has been a widow himself, and that was the reason for the start of this workshop. It's a passion for him and his family. And we really appreciate him coming in today and speaking with us today. We have one session now, and then after lunch we'll have another session. But we also have several sessions on Sunday, so we want to encourage you to come back and join us then as well. Indeed, I really appreciate you bringing up Job and the work and thinking about his wife. You know, we never think about his wife, do we, when we read that story? We never think about what she had lost, and I think it's very important that we kind of look at this. So if you would, go ahead and give Dean your attention, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
We want to make sure everybody gets not everybody, every family represented here gets a notepad. Cheryl Wayne, have you distributed those?
Hold on a minute, Grandpa's trying to get all of it done.
The notepads, we should have enough to have one for every family that's represented here. And that's a gift from the Widowhood Workshop Ministry to you. And it has some information, some contact information at the bottom of those notepads. And we want you to feel free to access anything that we have in the ministry and share that availability of that access with anybody else that you think we might be able to help. While Cheryl Wayne is passing those out, let me share with you a story. I like to make fun of married people, since I'm not one. Bob forgot his 25th wedding anniversary. I'm sure no man in this room ever did that. But Bob forgot his 25th wedding anniversary. His wife got real mad about that. And she told him as she stomped upstairs to the bedroom, tomorrow morning I expect to find a gift in the driveway that goes from 0 to 206 seconds. And it better be there, and it better be red. And the next morning when she woke up, she looked out the window and she found a box in the driveway that was red, gift wrapped in the middle of the driveway. She opened it up and she knew what it was going to be, but what she found was a brand new set of red bathroom scales that could go from 0 to 200 in less than 6 seconds, and Bob has been missing ever since that 25th wedding anniversary. Ouch. Well, one of the things that we do in these workshops is we talk about loss in general, but we make it a special point in 2 of the sessions to focus on widowhood, and I think for good reason. We talked about how that a marriage can end by divorce as well as death. But have you ever thought about this? How does every good marriage end? Every one of them. There's only one way. Now, miserable marriages or mediocre marriages could end in divorce or desertion or something like that. But how does every good marriage end? Death. It'd be really good for married people to learn about loss, especially widowhood, before they experience it. I would never do, and this was a personal policy of mine, I just established this policy as a local preacher. I do not want to officiate at any wedding ceremony unless the couple was willing to go through extensive premarital counseling. Now, not because I thought that would totally prepare them for everything after they transition from being single to being married, but I knew it would help them make the transition from being single to being married. What should we do for married people who one of the 2 of them is going to transition from being married to being widowed? What are we doing to help them? I think that's one reason why we need to think out loud together and study about the subject of widowhood to help married people. So we're going to focus on widowhood here, and I'm going to explain to you a little bit about how this ministry got started. My wife, the woman who became my wife, was born in Dover, Ohio, which is in northeast Ohio, and she graduated from high school there. We got married when we were 19 years old, something I would not recommend to 19-year-old people, but we did that. And we were married for my sophomore, junior, and senior year in college. We were blessed with 3 daughters. One lives in Middle Tennessee, one lives in the Atlanta, Georgia area, and one lives in Gainesville, Florida. You know they were raised right because if you see on their t-shirt there in the bottom right, it says, God first, then family, then the Ohio State Buckeyes. We spent the vast majority of our life in Ohio, my wife and I did, and this is where she is buried, and this was a picture taken several months after her passing with our 5 grandchildren. I'm glad that she was able to see all of our 5 grandchildren. Can you imagine being in a hospital bed in your house and your small grandchild placed with you in that bed, but you don't have the ability to raise your arms up and hug that baby? Have you ever thanked the Lord for the ability to hug? There are a lot of blessings that we enjoy in life that other people don't enjoy in their lives, but we do. But because we haven't thought more specifically, we haven't thanked the Lord, I'm afraid, for a lot of things. You know, that story about the 10 lepers that were cleansed in Luke 17. And we typically come down hard on the 9 who did not return to praise the Lord. Now, there was one that came back and praised the Lord and expressed the gratitude by praising the Lord for his cleansing. Now, do you know whether or not the 9 were grateful or not? Now, be real careful. Think about this. Do you know that the 9 were not grateful for the blessing? What do you know? You do know they did not express their gratitude. We don't know that they were ungrateful. They may not have been 9 ingrates. They may have been 9 grateful people who just never expressed the gratitude. Have you ever had a blessing that you didn't express thanks for? This is the way you shake your head. Because we all have. We all have abundant blessings, precious, invaluable blessings that we've never thought about before until somebody prompts us to think about them. No matter how good the marriage is, there's only one way for it to end if it's a good marriage, and that's by death. So on Christmas morning at 9:40 in the morning, 2013, she passed away. The Parkinson's disease got up into her respiratory system, and she just quit breathing. So about 3 weeks after that, I was sitting in my empty house. I was the only person there, and I experienced something I'd never experienced before. I typically am not like a child who doesn't have a filter between their brain and their lips, and stuff comes out with children. But that particular occasion, something just kind of came out. It wasn't like I pre-planned to say this out loud. I'm not a talk to yourself kind of person. Now, some people are, and that's okay. As long as you talk back to yourself, I think that's important too. There needs to be give and take in conversation. But on that particular occasion, I was sitting there about 3 weeks after my wife passed away. And I said out loud, why did I say this out loud? In an empty house, there was nobody else there. I said, what's wrong with me? I was falling apart. I was a mess. And I said out loud, what's wrong with me? And then I did what anybody does whenever they want an answer to a question. You go to the internet, because everything you read there is true. So I got the laptop out, and I started searching for help for widowed people. I especially started looking for ministries to help widowed people. And guess what I found? Virtually nothing. And I thought, wow, somebody ought to do something about this. And I thought about, and I was 61 years old at the time, I thought about, I'd never preached a sermon about widowhood. I'd never taught a class about widowhood, about living life after the loss of your spouse. And yet, I'd done all kinds of funerals. I'd been with all kinds of people when they had lost their spouses. And yet, it never dawned on me to do study about that and to preach or teach about that subject. You think I changed my mind and thought differently after my wife died? I sure did. So I got my family together and I convinced them, let's launch a family passion project. We'll call it Widowhood Workshop. We'll raise awareness about loss, about all kinds of different losses, but we'll do a special focus on widowhood, and we'll make it a point of challenging churches to start local ongoing widowhood ministries. And so all 13 people in my family are involved in the Widowhood Workshop ministry, and they all have their different responsibilities. I want us to think out loud together now a little bit about widowhood. I want to share with you some information that when I started doing some research, and have been researching this since 2013, I want to share with you some, I think, very interesting information that really might cause you to think a lot differently when you leave here today than when you came. We are a minority. Those of us who've experienced the loss of our spouse, we are a minority, about 6% of the population. But when you talk about 65 years and older, a third of the population is widowed. Who's ministering to those people? Now, if you were to break that down to gender, 37% of the women in our country, 65 years and older, that's way over a third of them are widowed, 12% of the men. Now, if you drop that down to 55, almost a third of the women who are 55 years and older, almost a third of them are widowed. And then, again, a much smaller number of men, 9% of the men. There are 20 million widowed people in our country, give or take. Of course, some remarry, some die, but there are between 1 million to 1.5 million every year in our country that lose their spouses. 6% of them are under 44 years old. When I was in Medina, Ohio, we were talking about things that people would relate to widowhood. Back in the back right corner, there was a guy named Denny. He raised his hand and he said, the first thing that I think about when I think about widowhood is I think of the word old. I said, yes, Denny, people typically do that. But I said, you don't have to be old to be widowed. All you have to do to be qualified to be widowed is to be married. Every married person is a prospective widowed person. And the only way for a good marriage to end is by death. That, I think, ought to cause us to study, to think out loud together about widowhood, to encourage other people to be prepared and help us to experience that part of our life. Some of the most inspiring people that I've met since my family started this ministry are not the old people, they're the young people. We could get in a bus and drive to Salina, Tennessee, where there's a young lady named Emily Moss. She was 34 years old and lying in bed and awakened one morning by her 36-year-old husband having a heart attack. She administered CPR. She called 911. He was taken to the hospital. He lived a couple of days and then died. She's 34 years old. They have a child. Her name is Evie. At that time, I think Evie was in the 2nd grade. Then we could get in the bus and we could go to West Tennessee, around Brownsville, Tennessee. and I could introduce you to Brittany, who one morning woke up married about 1,300 days. I know that because she wrote a blog about this experience. Her husband, Bradford, was driving through Trenton, Tennessee. He was in an awful car accident, and he died. She woke up in her late 20s, married. And then when the sun went down that night, she was widowed. I can take you to Western Kentucky, and we can go to Tandy's house. And Tandy came in one day and put her purse on her washer and dryer like always. Walked down the hallway, and then she went into this room and saw her husband laying there in a pool of blood and the gun. She was in her 30s. We could go to down into southwest Missouri or southwest Georgia, and we could meet Buffy. Buffy had a child, a little over a year old, and she was a teacher at a faith-based school and still is. And every day at lunchtime, she called her husband. This one day at lunchtime, she called her husband, and when they hung up that day, she decided to go to the car and drive to the house. It was a 45-minute commute. On the way to the house, she called her dad, who was a police officer. She said, "Dad, would you go to the house? I'm concerned about him." Her father, fortunately, got to the house first. He had taken his own life. You don't have to be old to be widowed. All you have to do is be married. When I was living in West Tennessee, just a few miles north of me, Cynthia had this happen. Her husband went out to do some welding on a piece of equipment. It was a diesel truck tank that he would use to take the diesel fuel out to the machinery in the fields, because all that's out there in that area is cotton and soybean farms. So he went out to do some welding. In that tank that day, there were 75% diesel fuel, 25% fumes, which was not a problem. But the problem was there was a pinhole leak in that tank. So when he cranked up the welding machine, it blew up. It blew the building up. It blew his body out of the building. She rushed and in the bathtub wet a bunch of towels and a bunch of comforters and went out and threw them on her husband's body. Her husband's body was life-flighted to Memphis, and he died about 24 hours later. Bad things happen in a fallen, broken world, and you don't know when, and you don't know who. You don't know if it's you or if it's going to be somebody else. But anybody who's married can be widowed. It would be a good idea for us to find out a little bit about loss before we experience it. 78% of the widowed are women. Now, there's a reason why there are more women widowed than males. Part of it's the women's fault, part of it's the men's fault. Number one, women live longer than men. The lifespan of a woman is longer than the lifespan of a man. Now, Cheryl Wayne, would you agree with me? That's our fault.
Amen.
We take so good care of you women that you live longer than we do.
Amen.
That is my explanation for women living longer than men. But that is statistically true. Women live longer than men. Now, here's another statistic. Typically, women marry guys who are older than they are. That's on you, women. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, but statistically, more often than not, women marry men who are older than they are. Now, if women are going to live longer than men, and then women choose to marry people who are older than they are, you're going to have a boatload of females who are widowed, not nearly as many men who are widowed. So if churches were to start local widowhood ministries, you'd be dealing with a lot more females than you would males. Now, let me give you some information about Lufkin, Texas. I always try to do this research before I go somewhere. Population, a little over 35,000. There are almost 13,000 households. If you were to get, just in Lufkin, I'm not talking about outside the city limits, I'm talking about in Lufkin, Texas. If you were to get all the females in Lufkin, Texas, 15 years and older. Now, for some reason, the U.S. government considers a 15-year-old an adult. That's not my fault. If you were to get all the women in Lufkin, Texas together, 15 years and older, 12% of them would be widowed. 12%. Now, what if we were to raise that 15 up to 20, and it was 20 years and older? That percentage would be way more than 12%. 2% of the men. If you are looking at the total population, and there are always more females than there are males, usually it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 51 to 52% female, and then the other male. If you were to guess about looking at the total population, and you were to guess about how many females there are 15 years and older, there are over 2,500 widowed females in Lufkin, Texas, at least. That's a lowball estimate. There are at least 2,500 widowed females in Lufkin, Texas. If you were to look at Angelina County, look countywide, and you were to get all of the women in this county 15 years and older, 11% of them would be widowed. Now again, if you lowball the estimate, the guesstimate, about how many females there are 15 years and older, you're talking about in this county well over 4,000 widowed females in Angelina County. Now, I just want to raise the question, who in the county or who in Lufkin is ministering to those who are living after the loss of their spouse? Wouldn't it be great if the churches of Christ became the church known in our country as the faith-based community that really loves and ministers to the widowed? That is a special way of raising the public image of the church in a community, glorifying God and being a blessing to others. We help, in our ministry, we help churches start local, ongoing widowhood ministries. Most of the books written about widowhood are written from a female perspective. There are very few written from a male perspective. I've written 3 books. All 3 of them are back there on the table. You can look at each one of them. One is Before the End Comes, talking about the end of your marriage. Before the End Comes, When the End Comes, and After the End Comes. All 3 of those books are written looking at both the male and female perspective. One of the things we try to do is provide promotional material that will promote the education of people about widowhood. That's a part of this ministry. There are 245 million widowed women in our world. 115 million of them live in abject poverty. One of the most sad articles I've ever read in print is in the National Geographic, February of 2017. There's an article here about widowed females in India. When I read this article, I thought, surely not, that human beings in our day and age, anywhere, would be treated like widowed females in India. India has over 40 million widowed females. China is the only country on the face of the earth that has more widowed females than India. China has about 44 million. India is just short of that in the 43 million category. What are we doing in regard to our missionary efforts in these countries, and are we encouraging them to engage in the practice of pure and undefiled religion where we minister to the widowed? Again, something to think about. Now, I'm going to open it up for us to think out loud together. God presents himself in a unique way in Scripture as a defender, a reliever, and a protector of the widowed. Now, that being true, what does that tell you about God and the widowed? He cares for them. What else does it say? He cares for the widowed. What else does it say? It implies that we should care. Why should we care, though? Because it says God is the defender, the reliever, and the protector. We're his hands and his feet. Some of you who are older than dirt, like me, might remember that song. He has no hands but our hands to do his work today. He has no feet but our feet. See, we're God's people who do his will. And what's his will? That the widowed be defended, protected, and relieved. We're God's huggers. We're God's comforters. We're God's encouragers. Wouldn't it be a great thing for us to make sure that we do that within the family of God, and then make sure that we show that kind of love, the love of God, to the widowed people in our community? Now, when you look at some of the scriptures about this subject, the righteous look at things differently than the widowed. The wicked don't care. They can slay the widow. And then even Job's friends, when they morphed into not such good friends, they made the accusation against Job. Job, you must have sent widows away empty. If you're suffering the way you are, you must have done something really bad. I'll bet maybe you've even sent widows away empty. Like that is the worst thing possible. See, even in that ancient culture, there was a sensitivity about those who've lost their spouse. In the book of Deuteronomy, the children of God are getting ready to cross the Jordan River and go into the land of Canaan. Now, when they go into the land of Canaan, what kind of people lived in the land of Canaan before God's people crossed the Jordan? What kind of people were they? They were heathens. They were barbarians. And God wanted his people to drive them out. Now, if you're going to go into the land of Canaan and you're going to drive these people out, don't you think it would be good to have a military strategy? Have any of you served in the military? There are rules of engagement, and there are plans. And when you're involved in a military engagement, you've got a plan. And when it comes to war, you're going to drive those people out, and you're going to do it with a military strategy. But what I find interesting is God does not have Moses give them a military strategy. Instead, he talks to them about how they ought to be and how they ought to behave. Now, Deuteronomy 24, let me read to you some of this. Verse 17 beginning. You shall not pervert justice, do the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. Now, there are three classes of people there. Stranger, some translations say foreigner. Fatherless, some translations say orphan. And then widows. Now, what do those three life circumstances have in common? Stranger, fatherless, widow. What do they share in common? It's more than one thing. Okay, they're alone. What else? If they're alone, what does that suggest to you? They need some help, don't they? They're very vulnerable. They're at risk. They're in jeopardy. So he says, you shall not pervert justice, do. In other words, this is something that needs to be done. And he says, you need to make sure, in verse 18, that you remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. Now he's going to start telling them to do some things. And it has nothing to do with military strategy. He says, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. But the Lord your God, he will bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember, here's the second time this is said, and you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing. Why did he remind them about Egypt? Twice. Why did he do that? What was he telling them? Now remember, he's talking to them about the stranger and the fatherless and the widow. Why does he bring up Egypt? How he treated them when they were in need. He says, now don't you forget, when you were in Egypt and you cried out for help and you were desperate, I not only heard, I responded. I took care of you. I did 10 awesome miracles to bring you out of bondage. Compassion. I showed compassion to you. Now you show compassion to others. People who are in jeopardy, people who are vulnerable, people who are in special need, you remember them. Miss Amy and I were at the Preston Crest Church of Christ in Dallas. We were there on a Sunday night, and after Sunday night, we left the room that we were in, and out in the foyer, there was this awesome wall interior. And it was 2 phrases. I took a picture of it. 2 phrases, 6 words. Passion for God, compassion for people. Passion for God, compassion for people. That's really what life is all about in regard to the right religion. That's what God wanted of Israel. God wanted of Israel a passion for Him and compassion for people. Jesus, when He came into this world, the same thing. He wants passion for God, compassion for people, especially those who are in uniquely needy life circumstances. And if you think that the loss of your spouse is not a uniquely needed situation, I beg you to come back after lunch. This 3rd session today, of all the 6 that I do in a workshop like this, in my opinion, is the most important one. People do not know what it is like to experience the loss of a spouse. If we don't know what it's like in somebody's life, we're not likely to have compassion for them because we don't know that they're in need. We don't know the gravity of the need. Well, God's people did not listen. And so sometime when you have time, you can go to Isaiah chapter 1. And when God sends Isaiah into their midst, one of the things that He tells them is He says, you didn't get it. And one of the things that He tells them, He says, you've become like Sodom and Gomorrah. You're unethical, and you're showing no compassion. One of the things that He challenges them to do in Isaiah chapter 1 is plead for the widowed. Twice it is mentioned in Isaiah chapter 1. You have missed the boat. Among other things, you've not been pleading for the widowed. You've not taken to heart what I told you through Moses in Deuteronomy 24. See, just because we hear things, and it's not just men, we're just worse at it than women, but just because you hear something doesn't mean that you take it to heart. The people of God were told about this, but they didn't take it to heart. And that's why God sent Isaiah to them, to help them to refocus on what was most important. But they missed the boat in regard to caring for the widowed. In Jesus' day, the leaders of Israel were accused of devouring widows' houses. So they're not blessing them, not helping them, they're actually hurting them. And then in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1, the church has grown phenomenally. Those first 5 chapters are just amazing. You read about all that growth and development of the first century church, and then you get to Acts chapter 6. Things have just been tremendous. Now in Acts chapter 5, you have that setback with Ananias and Sapphira, but that really turns out to be a blessing because people came to fear the Lord even more because of Ananias and Sapphira's sin and their death as a result of that. So they've been truly shaken. And the church is continuing to grow. As a matter of fact, chapter 6, verse 1 starts this way. Now, in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplying, sometimes you read about disciples being added, and then you see another arithmetic word, multiply. Now, how are you going to get to a higher number? By adding or by multiplying? Multiplying, see, we're talking about a big number here. Wayne Jackson, in his commentary on the book of Acts, suggests that when you get to Acts chapter 6, verse 1, we may be talking about a church of about 20,000. Now, a bunch of that 20,000 came from all over the inhabited world. They'd come to Jerusalem for Pentecost. They were not planning on staying as long as they ended up staying. They didn't know what was going to happen in Acts chapter 2, and the church was going to get started. Can you imagine the needs when you have, imagine something happening where you've got all these people from all over Texas flooding this county and having to stay a lot longer than they planned on. Can you imagine the nightmare that would be? The logistical nightmare that would be, taking care of these people who were coming from all over the place to come into this county. You know, in regard to immigration, we're having that very issue. Texas is getting a big brunt of that force, of that immigration, these people coming. What are you going to do about the logistical nightmare of taking care of people? Now, here's what I want you to think about for a minute. As the church was growing in those first 5 chapters, don't you find it interesting that there's no mention of any benevolent ministry weakness until now in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1? Of all of the logistical nightmare, why would this one ministry weakness be the one that's mentioned in Acts chapter 6 verse 1? I think it's consistent with what you read in the Old Testament. What's near and dear to the heart of God? People who are in uniquely needy situations. So these people have a problem. There arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. Neglected in the daily distribution. Now, Cheryl Wayne is going to tell you about the 3 C's. Cheryl Wayne knows all about the 3 C's.
To set the stage for this a little bit, Brother Dean and I were at the Fried Hardeman lectureships a couple years ago, and this brother came by, and we were visiting with him, and he said, you know, we in the church are wonderful with the 3 C's, and Dean and I kind of looked at each other like, we're not following you on this. And he said, yeah, we're real good to taking care of folks with the 3 C's. Those 3 C's are, after they've had a loss, casseroles. No, I've got it backwards. Cards, condolences, and casseroles for the first 2 weeks, and then we think its time is over. You need to move on with this. And it's a very vital point.
In our culture and in the church, we're very good at immediate care, helping people who have lost loved ones, especially the widowed. We rush to their aid. But what about the long-term needs? See, there are long-term needs just like there are those immediate needs. What are we doing to minister to those people? Well, I think the reason why we have neglected, now in the book of Acts, there were issues above and beyond what is normal nowadays. But I think in our present time, the reason why widowed people are often neglected is because we just don't know what they're going through. It's because of that ignorance and inexperience that we don't minister to them. The same thing is true with people who've gone through the agony of divorce. The same thing is true with people who have gone through the loss of their health and they are diagnosed with cancer or Parkinson's disease. If we are not familiar with, if we don't know about what it's like to experience something, it's very likely that we're going to neglect people who we know in our friendship network who have those issues that they're dealing with. But if we don't know what it's like and we don't know what they're struggling with, we're not going to minister to them effectively because we're ignorant and we're inexperienced. And everybody is ignorant and inexperienced. We all are about different things. We have, sadly, I think, really neglected the widowed. But I want to look at a verse that you are very familiar with, this verse here. I want you to go back to English class, and I want you to identify the subject of this sentence. You've heard this verse. You've read this verse. What's the subject of this sentence? It's only one word. I don't want any modifiers yet. Religion. What are the modifiers? What kind of religion? Pure and undefiled. Now, if there's pure and undefiled religion, what does that imply? Is that the only kind? There's also impure and defiled religion. I have news for our culture. This is not well received in our culture. All religion is not equal. All religion is not right. Jesus Christ did not come into this world to bring religion. Religion already existed when he came into this world. And the Jewish people had really messed it up. Jesus came into this world to bring right religion. Now, what's involved in right religion in the sight of God? Now, we need to be moral, ethical people, right? Keep ourselves unspotted from the world. But there's another verb there in that same sentence besides keep. What's the other verb? Visit. Now, who are we supposed to visit? They're objects of that verb. Two classes of people, right? Okay, now, I want you to think about that word visit. This word visit in the Greek language has to do with looking over and inspecting a situation for the purpose of addressing the issue. That's what visiting is in biblical terms. When we visit somebody, what we do is we find out, we research, we become familiar with what the situation is, and then we seek to address it. That's what visiting is in Scripture. Now, let's go back to that verse. Who are the first people that are the objects of that word? The first object of visit is orphans. Okay, what have we done to help children who are at risk? These are children who are in jeopardy, who are at risk. What have we done to help with that? I'm talking about in our culture, especially in our brotherhood, what have we done? Are there any orphans' homes in Texas? What we used to call orphans' homes, now we call them children's homes. And we send, churches support them, or individuals or families send money. You can go to Valparaiso, Indiana, and there's Schultz Lewis Children's Home. You can go to the north side of Cincinnati, Ohio, and there's Midwestern Children's Home. You can go to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and there's Potter Children's Home. You can go into Tennessee Children's Home in West Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and East Tennessee. You can go to Alabama, and there's North Alabama Children's Home. In the Brotherhood, not only in our country, but where we have missionaries, we have started children's homes. We are ministering to children who are in highly dysfunctional families, who need help, who need protection, who need counseling, who need training. Now, there's a second object to the same verb. Visit orphans, then who else? Okay, what have we done in the Brotherhood that is similar? See where I'm going? What have we done in the Brotherhood that's anywhere near what we have done in regard to ministering to the people in the first category? That's one reason why My Family's Passion Project was launched. That's why it exists. And one thing that we try to do is raise awareness about loss, especially spousal loss, and maybe even help churches start local ongoing widowhood ministries. It's a great outreach to the community. If you have well over 4,000 widowed females in Angelina County, that is a great harvest. Showing compassion for them is also displaying passion for God. When we have passion for God, we have compassion for people. And when we have compassion for people and we know what it's like, or at least we're trying to understand what it's like in their life, we seek to minister to them. I really encourage churches to start local ongoing widowhood ministries for that very reason. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, the most valuable ministry and the first line of ministry to the widowed, though, is not the church, it's the family. 1 Timothy 5, verse 3 beginning, honor widows who are really widows. Now, I thought every widow was really widowed, but you get the idea here when you read the next verse. But if any widow has children, there's a distinction made in this passage between the widowed who have no children or grandchildren and the widowed who have children or grandchildren. Now, those widowed people who have children or grandchildren, notice what it says in verse 4. If any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. What did your parents do for you Or what did your grandparents do for you? That's a debt. A debt that we may have an opportunity to return or begin to pay whenever they've lost their spouse. And then it says in verse 16 of that chapter, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. And that particular word relieve there carries the idea of ministering to them, honoring them. Let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Now, when it comes to those who have family, we need to make sure that we step up. Now, how can we step up and minister to them if we do not know what they're going through? I did not minister to my mother as effectively as I should have and could have after my dad died. Whenever my dad died, I thought I was doing the right thing. I knew it was my responsibility to step up and to help my mother. She no longer had my father. But I had not read a book about widowhood. I didn't know anything about what it was like to live after the loss of a spouse. So I was ignorant and I was inexperienced because I still had a wife. So in my inexperience and my ignorance, I did some limited things. If she needed somebody to go with her to the doctor, I was there. I was 50 minutes away, but I was there. If she needed somebody to help with the checkbook, my wife and I made sure that that was taken care of. Her grass looked better than anybody's grass on the whole street because I did it. Every week I did it. I'm borderline OCD and I'm a recovering control freak. But I was really proud of how that yard looked. It was better than anybody else's in her neighborhood. But one day, I was sitting with her in her private room in her orthopedic recovery. I'm the second of 4 boys. And she said this. Now, we're the only 2 in the room. She said, I wish I would have had a daughter. Now, God graced me with special self-control. And I didn't say what I was thinking. And there was just dead silence after she said that. There was silence before she said that, and then there was dead silence after she said that. And then I had a stroke of genius. This doesn't happen very often, but I had this stroke of genius. And I thought, and I said this sincerely, genuinely, Mom, I wished you would have had a daughter too. For years, I thought I was cheated because I never had a sister. I would have loved to have had a sister way more than I tolerated a brother. But I never, and then it dawned on me after years, I had a whole church full of sisters, and I didn't have to endure their puberty. So I was really blessed. I enjoyed all the sisters in the church. Upon reflection, I got to think, I knew what she meant by that. You women are gifted by God to be better at human relationships, better at exhibiting compassion. Us guys can do it. We're a work in progress, a whole lot slower than females. And there are things that it takes us a while to learn and to understand. We can all be more compassionate and we can all be better servants of other people. But sometimes in our ignorance and inexperience, we're not what we could be and should be. You know what my mother needed more of that I didn't understand? She needed more of me. Because life's about people and relationships and experiences. That's what she needed. She needed more of me. I could have hired a kid to do the yard. It wouldn't have looked nearly as good as what I did. But I had to do that. I felt that was really important for me. But see the struggle that we have sometimes in our ignorance and inexperience? So we need to learn about this so that we can minister to our parents and grandparents the way we should. I think in the Lord's church, what we need to do, if this is a family responsibility, and it is, 1 Timothy 5, then we need to teach it. And we need to help people understand this is what widowhood is like. Again, after lunch, you're going to have a come to Jesus opportunity here. You're going to be able to visit into the head and heart of a widowed person. You're not going to be ignorant anymore after this afternoon. But knowing more can help us to better minister to their needs. We know what questions to ask, and we know how to minister to them only when we understand better. So in our local churches, I think what we need to do is we need to start having a class, maybe every couple of years, where we talk about this kind of thing. Because in our local communities, in our local churches, there are married people who are dying all the time. And families are not going to minister to their widowed people unless they know something about what it's like. So what are we going to do in regard to ministering to the widowed? We need to respond to that question, both within our families and within the church. Now, who's supposed to be raising kids? Whose job is that? It's the parents, isn't it? But why do we have youth ministries? And that's good, for good reason. Parents need help because that's a big job. And churches having youth ministries helps to supplement the efforts of the primary responsible people, the parents, in regard to the children. The same way, I think we need to look at the widowed. It's first and foremost the family responsibility. We need to educate families. But then we need to provide a second line of defense and a ministry to encourage both the caregivers and encourage those who are being ministered to, the widowed. The two working together can be a blessing to those who are living their life after their loss. I hope that's food for thought. And speaking of food, let's eat. Dr. Seuss has been canceled by our culture, but not by the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. I love this saying, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, it's not going to change until you care a whole awful lot. And when we care, things will change and get better. Paul?
Dean, we really appreciate your words. It has been very, very educational. Hopefully you have gained a lot from this. I was talking to some people earlier. They said this is wonderful. They appreciate it. Good stuff. Stick around. We have great food. I know because I just sampled some of it. So I really appreciate it. Here in a minute, I'm going to ask our preacher to come up. Scout Betts, I almost forgot your name. I was thinking about that food. I was going to come up and offer a blessing for the food. We're going to be here again tomorrow. Worship starts at 9. Dean will be, worship, the Bible class is at 9, but Dean's going to be speaking at 9, and then 10, and then at 5 tomorrow. But we'll have one more session today. We want to encourage you to stick around for that. If there's nothing else, Scout, why don't you come up and offer blessings for the food. Thank you all so much for being here today.
We bow with me. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day you've given us, thankful for the rain you've blessed us with yesterday and the cool weather we have this morning. Father, thank you for Brother Dean and his words here that he has put together this workshop. We're thankful for the opportunity that we have to be here as brothers and sisters and also those in the community to come here and just learn things that we don't often think about or learn better. Father, thank you for the ability we have to hope through loss, and though it is very difficult to deal with, that we can overcome it and go through that forest and work out on the other side. Father, we thank you at this time for the food that's been prepared. We pray that it may give us strength and we may continue on to be back here this afternoon, but also to be about your service, Lord, in all that we do. We thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, in whom all this is possible. We pray this through his name. Amen.
One thing I failed to mention, go through the exit. That's the exit of the auditorium. And we're going to go in this way, and then the progression. I just want to make the mention that coming two different directions. Thank you all.